I am Lonzen Rujira, and my question goes to Professor Lumumba. You mentioned three imperatives that Kwame Nkrumah put on the table in 1963, and the one that was reinforced in 1964 in Cairo about the inviolability of the border. And the initial two, you said that Lumumba was right, but you did not assess whether Lumumba was right about the inviolability of the African border. And I put the question to you, was Lumumba right or wrong? Was Nkrumah right or wrong? Secondly, the question about the invisible hand that is always managing African affairs. It's been more than 50 years that Lumumba put this warning, that Nkrumah put this warning on the table.
Lumumba and Nkrumah the same.
Nkrumah put this warning on the table, more than 50 years, that be careful, the colonial master has not gone anywhere. He is going to reappear only in a new form. And it's been 50 years, and that hand has not gone anywhere. Are people not listening? Thank you.
Okay. Gacaca.
Thank you very much, moderator, for kindly giving me the floor. Unlike your predecessors. My name is Gatete Nyiringabo, I'm a lawyer. And I wanted to put this question of accountability, of compatibility between democratic systems, classical democratic systems, and our political systems, especially our ruling movements, that do not quite define themselves as political parties per se, like the RPF would not define itself as a political party, does not see itself as so, and its modus operandi isn't one of a classical political party. It calls itself a revolutionary movement. But this is true for the RPF, but also for the Frelimo, for the MPLA, and some of these African freedom fighting movements. So that's a question to Professor Shaka. And a question to Professor Lumumba is the concept of democracy versus the concept of Ubuntu, which is an African bioethic, which defines that what I think of is relevant only if considered against what my kin, my community, my society thinks of. And therefore, because democracy comes as a rather individualistic system. I remember when the Magna Carta was being enacted, slavery was still there, women did not vote. Democracy really came as a club of men, white men, drinking whiskey, smoking cigar, and talking about their slaves, their wives, and their horses. But today, women can also vote. Black people can also have a say. Democracy becomes unpopular because the majority societies where we know that define themselves as societies of democracy, usually only roughly 10 to 20% of the population partake. The majority only exercise the democratic right to resist the democratic system that is in place. So I'd like to put these questions to you. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Major Robert Kajuka from Rwanda Defense Force, a student. My question goes to Professor Lumumba. Sir, for decades we have witnessed different trends in Africa political systems. There is a time when violent coup d'etats were used to change the governments. Then later we saw revolution wars being used to overthrow government and resolve conflicts. Of recent, there is a new trend where military have used what I can call silent coup d'etats to overthrow governments. Example would be Zimbabwe, Algeria, and of recent, Sudan. My question is, what has triggered this new trend? And what is its impact to Africa's pursuit of sustainable peace, stability, and development? And is there any possibility of involvement of non-state actors in this new trend? Thank you, sir.
Thank you. Let me start by warning myself that when I talk about Africa, I'm not blind to the fact that there are 55 African countries. And sometimes it is very easy to assume that I'm talking about a homogeneous thing. It is not. I'm alive to the reality that what I'm saying about Rwanda is not necessarily what I would be saying about Senegal. But there are certain things that I think are unique to the African nations, and I'm talking about African nations in the narrow sense. So that when we talk about democracy, and I prefer the word accountability and people's involvement in governance, I'm simply warning ourselves that nobody should define for us what democracy is. If we choose as the people of Rwanda to embrace a governing system that is satisfactory and which the majority of the people think is right, that is our system. We should not be in the business of pleasing others who define for us and have a litmus test which they dip into some democratic bottle, and then if it turns green, then we are democratic. I think that if we are alive to that, then we are doing the right thing. And you mentioned Gacaca, which in my view defines how, when you define yourselves and you do your own things, you achieve better results. If you compare the Arusha Tribunal and Gacaca and what they have achieved, there is the difference is between day and light, day and night. In terms of what Gacaca achieved within the same time, you look at the expense and what it does to the society. But I'm quite certain that there were certain legal Puritans from Western capitals who would have frowned upon Gacaca, saying, what is this? It is because the people of Rwanda simply said, this is our system. Our people understand it. It's going to repair the damages that have been caused to the extent that is humanly possible. And I'm saying that in our conception of democracy, we can also choose that and pursue that. And if we are sufficiently persistent, people will then begin to recognize that we have governance systems that can work. And it is happening. If you go to Botswana, for example, they have their own systems which incorporates what we describe as modern. The other problem we have is that anything African is not modern. So I'll use the word modern as understood in this sense. You go to Botswana, you have a house of chiefs because they have recognized that the chieftaincy system has a role to play. You go to Malawi or you go to Zambia, they recognize traditional rulers. You go to Nigeria, the same. You go to many parts of West Africa, they recognize that these systems, they are not perfect. Nobody is saying they are perfect, but they have a role to play. And I'm saying that going forward, we should not ignore them. There are lessons to be learned from them, and I think if we embrace them, perhaps they are going to help us in achieving sustainable peace. You asked about the neo-colonial project. In my view, and I stand to be corrected on this, I think the neo-colonial project is alive and well. It is alive and well in very many subtle ways. A friend of mine asked, and this I say to at the risk of annoying my friend Michel, the Commonwealth, for example, the colonizer knew, I'm losing my colonies, but I must create something that doesn't look harmful. And this thing is the Commonwealth of my former colonies. So that even when I designate ambassadors, our ambassadors are not called ambassadors, they are high commissioners. The head of the Commonwealth will perpetually be the British monarch. These are very subtle ways. Not saying that there are no benefits to being a part of the Commonwealth, I'm not saying so. But these are subtle ways in which you remain in control of your former colonies. If you go to France, they have the Organization for Former or French-speaking Nations. And they bring you together so that if there is a problem, the first port of call, if there is a problem in Cote d'Ivoire, the first port of call is not Addis Ababa, the African Union, no. It is the former French colonies. When you are giving, they gain independence, you give them a currency, the CFA, which is regulated from Paris. These are very subtle ways. And you know, when I look at, because we have gone to school in this system, even the education system is very deliberate. When I'm thinking as one trained in the English way, my inclination is to think essentially like an English person. And I think that these are the things that Nkrumah was warning us against. And there are many writings to this effect. I want you to read, for whatever it's worth, just read Ngugi wa Thiong'o's Decolonizing the Mind. Ngugi is telling us, learn the ways, because they are beautiful things to be learned from other civilization. But absorb that which is useful to you and discard that which is detrimental. What we have succeeded in doing is that we have learned, and the bad things that are not useful to us are the things that we embrace. So Nkrumah was right in that regard. And you can see it in many of our countries. You go to any of our countries, go to Angola. When there is investment, what we call foreign direct investment, 95% it will be from Portugal. You go to Equatorial Guinea, is the same. You go to Cote d'Ivoire, it is the same. We may deny it, but it's the truth.
Can I?
And then the question of the boundaries. The boundaries, Nkrumah warned us, and I think that Nkrumah and those who are there were simply saying, all these things that we have created called countries are artificial. And somebody, I think, put it very well. I don't know whether it was Uganda's President Yoweri Museveni, and he was just being melodramatic, but he made the point. He said that when they created Uganda, with the Kenya-Uganda border, if you had a wife, you slept, you're on both sides in a place, and the following day you woke up with your wife in Uganda and your husband in Kenya. And you have communities divided in that way. And if you are to start to redraw these boundaries, then there would be conflict. So he said, let us retain them. But we have seen that in the recent past, for some reason, we have created other countries. Out of Sudan, we now have South Sudan. And you could also see the very deliberate act of the colonizer, that almost on the eve of independence, the countries were put together. In Nigeria, almost on the eve of independence, the countries were put together. In Cameroon, which is now a problem, and it allows me, Cameroon allows me to tell you how the neo-colonial countries still work. Only 2 days ago, I think there was a vote on the issue of Cameroon. Everybody acknowledges that what is happening in the southern Cameroons is something that ought to have the world attention. See who voted against it. France, with the rest of the other countries. All the other permanent members and others voted in favor of the right thing. But France chose a position that is in support of the current administration for good reason. And see how southern Cameroon is defined, to tell you how the neo-colonial project works. Francophone and Anglophone. If you go to the so-called Anglophone, I suspect that 95% of the population cannot speak English, but they are defined as Anglophone. You go to the Francophone, 95% of they cannot say anything beyond we and no, but they are defined as Francophone. In other words, even the manner see even right now, which continent is defined in linguistic terms? It is Africa. Anglophone, Lusophone, Francophone. And I'm submitting, therefore, that the whole idea of boundaries was, let us do the best. And that is why Kwame was saying, let us unite, because when we unite, then we dissolve the boundaries. The boundaries simply become administrative, and they don't become things that would lead us to war. And I look forward to the day that that will be achieved, so that we have these porous boundaries where I fly to Rwanda 1 hour and 30 minutes, I have a different currency. I go to Uganda 25 minutes, I have a different currency. I go to Sudan, I have all other currency. And that is why 55 of us, the 1.5 billion of us, all our currencies are not defined. If they are not hard, then they must be soft. All our currencies are soft currencies. Systems and changes. You've talked about the changes that we have seen in the last few years. It is now in the public domain that the first coup d'etats that were mounted in Africa were at the behest of the erstwhile colonizers. We know Ludo de Witt, he's not a Congolese, has written that Patrice Emery Lumumba was murdered at the behest of the Belgians. We know that Kwame Nkrumah was overthrown at the behest of the Americans and the British. We know that Sylvanus Olympia was eliminated at the behest of the French. We know. Because we know that Modibo Keita of Mali was eliminated at the behest of France. Much more recently, we know that Thomas Sankara was eliminated at the behest of the French. We know all these. And it is because if anybody emerges who is articulating a vision which is in danger of compromising the pernicious role of these erstwhile colonizers, then he has to be neutralized. These are contentious views, but they are views that are there nevertheless. And then, of course, we know that there were proxy wars that were being fought. Everybody knew, for example, that Mobutu Sese Seko was running something that was improper. But it was in the interest of certain powers, which are not African, that Mobutu remains. We know that Jean Bedel Bokassa was running something that was not proper, but it was in the interest of certain powers that he remains. And we are therefore saying that it took the people themselves, and this brings me to the final limb of this question. It took the people themselves to begin to liberate themselves from such method. It took Meles Zenawi in Ethiopia to overthrow the system. It took Paul Kagame and RPF to solve the problem in Rwanda. It took Yoweri Museveni to solve the problem. It took Robert Mugabe to solve the problem. It took Samora Machel. It took Agostino Neto. Because the people are now saying, nobody is going to solve our problems. We've got to solve our problem. The tragedy is the leaders of the revolution ended up being the abusers of the revolution. And that is where we now find ourselves when the people are now coming up. The Arab Spring is a product, in my assessment, and I may be mistaken, of the people saying, you have betrayed us. And if you see what is happening in Khartoum, they are saying, no, this time round we are not going to do what they did in Egypt, leaving the street too early. We want to leave the streets only when we are guaranteed that we, the civilians, will be in control, because you, the men and women in uniform, have cheated us once before. And therefore, they are saying the people are the guarantors of power, that power springs from the people, not from the barrel of the gun, a la Mao. And therefore, you can see, therefore, in the recent past, even when the armed forces are taking over power in what I call velvet coup d'etats, as we saw in Mugabe's Zimbabwe, they don't want to call it a coup. It has all the ingredients of a coup, but nobody calls it a coup. Nobody calls it a coup, but you know it is a coup because you want to have the people behind you. I think that is a good thing. The African people is now beginning to assert, the African peoples are now beginning to assert themselves, and the leaders are now beginning to recognize that they hold their positions in trust for the people. And I think that that is a good thing. They are the guarantors of leadership, and going forward, that is good for sustainable peace in terms of, I see you are impatient, but there is a last point I'll make.
Yes.
The last point I'm going to make is the thing called democracy. If you look at successive elections in Africa, turnouts are becoming lower and lower. The most recent election in South Africa, you've seen the turnout has gone down. And I look at the young people saying, why did you not vote? You say, there is nothing to vote for. In other words, something must happen. When you find young people are saying there is nothing to vote for, we must be very worried, because the mandate you are getting through that process is a questionable mandate. And this is what leads me to my last point. We must have a system where the critical majority of the people are involved in the process. And this is not from me. Kenya's Ali Mazrui did a documentary in 1980s, which I commend to all of us who love Africa. Africa, the triple heritage. And the line that I think is the pièce de résistance is this. He said, Africa produces what it does not consume and consumes what it does not produce. And I'm suggesting to us that even in matters democracy, We must begin to consume what we generate from within our ranks for the sake of sustainable peace. I know what I've said may not enjoy unanimity, but I think it should annoy people in a constructive way to begin thinking in some useful direction. Thank you.
Can I just make one point? I'd like to urge the professor to remove the Commonwealth from his neo-colonialist architecture. And let me explain why. He is entirely right that when the Commonwealth was set up, it was to mask Britain's decline as an imperial power. And remember, it was a British Prime Minister who came to South Africa to talk about the winds of change blowing across Africa. A very important speech by Harold Macmillan. So it was designed, and the titles, as you rightly say, are different from Ambassador, to mask that. But it isn't anymore. And the next year, the big Commonwealth Heads of Government meeting will take place in Kigali. At the moment, the team that the President has set up is working with the Commonwealth Secretariat in London, which is independent of the British government, to decide what will be discussed and how the conference will be run. And the Commonwealth has become a genuine family of nations in which Britain is not the leader. And although, as you rightly say, Prince Charles, who is the heir apparent in Britain, has been elected as head of the Commonwealth by Commonwealth leaders, it was by no means certain that he would be. And it was last year that the Commonwealth leaders got together when he was not in the room, Britain was not in the room, and decided that they would like him to be their head. So I would just urge you to Rwanda has decided that they want to join the Commonwealth for very good reasons, and which is it is a great club of people who share a common set of values.
Consider that. After Kigali, I'll consider.
But he's absolutely right about the French. The French, the Francophonie is about the French having their hands on what is happening in Africa, and indeed some of their former colonies have representation in the French Assemblée Nationale. And we've lived next door to the French for many thousands of years, so we know the French very well. And you know the French too, but it's a very different setup in the Francophonie to the setup in the Commonwealth.
Thank you very much, Honorable Mitchell.
Thank you, sir. Major Gabarin, Nigerian Army student. So my question is to Professor Lumumba. Sir, in your presentation, you made mention of how Africans were able to come out of our diversity strong against all odds. So, sir, in line with the vision of our past leaders like Kwame Nkrumah about achieving a united Africa. So what do you think is the reason that is hampering the unity of Africans to achieve one united, strong, and indivisible Africa? What do you think is the reason that is hampering us? Thank you, sir.
Very quickly, number one, the question of the chiefs, traditional systems. It is true that traditional systems are inherently, some of them are inherently very dictatorial and do not allow participation. But what is important is to recognize that progressively the African peoples are becoming very assertive. And I can say without fear of contradiction that the safety of what we define as democracy demands that the people are eternally vigilant. And if people are vigilant, then those who are in positions of authority will know that if they don't make the right moves, then the people will rise, they'll remain in the streets, and they will not leave the streets until they themselves leave. And I think that is beginning to happen in a number of African countries. As to models, these are very young countries. After many African countries, after we regained our independence, we are very young. But one can begin to see, and I agree with the Honorable Minister here, he says that the people of Rwanda are beginning to lay a foundation for a model, which is uniquely Rwandan. And I believe that that is something that we can begin to celebrate. Ethiopia, despite her problems, is also beginning to lay a foundation. Tanzania, one can cite. So from Africa, one is beginning to see that models are coming out. They are going to go through their trials and tribulations, but is it not through those trials and tribulations that they grow stronger? Second and lastly, on the question of African unity. I believe that achieving African unity is now much more difficult than it was 50 years ago, but it's going to happen. Not in your lifetime, not in mine, perhaps in 100 years. And I can begin to see the building blocks. When people meet in Kigali and they talk about the African continent free trade area, one is beginning to recognize that when you begin to trade, and Rwanda, DRC becomes much more important via trade to Rwanda and Burundi and Central African Republic, in 50 years' time, then those boundaries are going to be dissolved and they are going to become irrelevant except for purpose of administration. And one can see the question of the free skies. One is beginning to talk about an African currency. We are beginning to talk about an African passport. This is not for the faint-hearted. It's not for those who want instant coffee solutions. It is for those who look to the future and to the next generation rather than tomorrow. 100 years' time is my projection about African unity in the manner that we desired. Thank you.